basically 4 points. First of all, Elizabeth's succession and reign. Secondly, the religious settlement of her time. Thirdly, Elizabeth and Mary Stuart, the relationship between the two. And fourthly, Elizabethan separatists. So the accession and reign. Now, there's many good books written of this Tudor period. It's well documented in general history. So I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to outline the career of Elizabeth. The first thing to say about her is that she lost her mother, Anne Boleyn, who was beheaded when Elizabeth was just 3.5. Mary had her imprisoned during her brief reign because she thought her to be the principal threat to her throne. She was strong and imperious, like her father, but she was also clever and shrewd, like her grandfather, Henry VII. And she picked advisors who were able and loyal. The foremost was the Chief Secretary of State, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, who served just about the whole of Elizabeth's reign, from 1558, when she came to the throne, to his death in 1598. So it was only 5 years of Elizabeth's life left at that stage. She showed political acumen in defying a predominantly Catholic Europe. I'll come back to that. Cecil was a great spy master. He had his spies all over the place to protect his queen, but he was ably assisted by the secretary of Elizabeth, her chief secretary, who was Walsingham. Walsingham played an important part in serving Elizabeth's life, particularly late on. So Elizabeth presided in a 45-year reign over a period of adventure. People like Drake and Frobisher and Hawkins and later Raleigh, great explorers and great seamen. And also there was a vast expansion of English trade and prosperity. This is rather like Henry VII built up this prosperity. Elizabeth did the same. Late in the reign, the East India Company in 1600 was founded. And that is the greatest trading company this world has ever known. So that part of Elizabeth's reign was very, very good. She remained unmarried, but had 2 favorites. First of all, Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, basically between about 1560 and 1588. And of course, there's an interesting and rather sinister background to that. I don't know whether anybody has read the novel Kenilworth by Sir Walter Scott. No? It centers around an incident involving a lady called Amy Robsart, who was secretly married to Leicester. And she was found at the bottom of a flight of stairs with a broken neck. There was great suspicion on Leicester, because at that stage he was hoping to marry Elizabeth. Anyway, it's a good novel, that, actually, if you want to read it, but that's the background to it, Kenilworth. But the later favourite was Robert Devereux, who was Earl of Essex. He was executed for treason in 1601. He rebelled against Elizabeth and her government, and he was taken and executed. Elizabeth's forces defeated the Armada in 1588, and again it turned to people like Drake and Frobisher and Hawkins, and the admiral of that time, Lord Howard of Effingham. Very interesting battle. Of course, the secular historians say that the Spanish Armada was unlucky to meet such bad weather, unusual weather in the English Channel. But I hope we can see the hand of God in that. delivering the nation, was not only actually intended to come upon England, but he also had an army settled in Europe, in Flanders, basically. And they were not only to come down and defeat England, but also they were to take the Dutch. They had an interest in the Netherlands, and they were hoping to defeat the Dutch nation completely and bring them into subjection to Spain. So there's two ideas there from Philip of Spain. Elizabeth died in 1603 at Richmond Palace at the age of 69. So she had a long reign and quite a long age. In fact, 69 years would be considered quite old in those days. And she was succeeded by James I, or James VI of Scotland, son of Mary Stuart and Lord Darnley. I'll come back to that later on. But secondly, the thing that probably interests us more is the religious settlement. There was an act of supremacy in 1559, which made Elizabeth head of the Church of England. So it started with Henry, it continued, unfortunately, with Edward VI, and of course Mary, and Elizabeth became head of the Church of England. Cranmer's prayer book continued to be used as a foundation of Anglican services, but the church, I would say, was Protestant rather than Catholic, and that's as much as can be said about it. It was a very moderate situation. Matthew Parker was the first Archbishop of Canterbury, and he established a moderate Church of England after the reign of terror of Mary. But they ignored, until late on anyway, the Puritans. Now, I think we should think about the Puritans. The Puritans have had a bad press over the years, but think of them as the conservative evangelicals of their time, and I think that's the best way to view them. So that was the situation. Parker, like Cecil, wanted to be aware of what was going on in religious circles. And it suggested that he was the original Nosy Parker. Now, well, that's true, I don't know, but succeeding bishops were of similar persuasion, very moderate. Sandys, Grindal, Whitgift, and the whole thing, the whole philosophy of the Church of England at that particular time was dictated by a book by a man called Richard Hooker, Ecclesiastical Polity, which indeed took an intermediate position between Catholicism and Protestantism. So Elizabeth shunned the Puritans. If there'd been men of the caliber of Latimer and Hooper around, things might have been different. But they were certainly around people of that caliber, but they were refused to be recognized by Elizabeth. And that was a sad thing. But things changed a little bit towards the end of, from the middle to the end of Elizabeth's reign, and continued into the reign of James and Charles. Positively, and we'll give credit to this, in 1562, about 4 years after she'd come to the throne, Elizabeth gave aid to the Protestant Huguenots in the French Wars of Religion, and she was appalled by the massacre that occurred in 1572, the massacre of the Huguenots on St. Bartholomew's Day. And that seriously affected the relations with France, which were never very good anyway. And then we'll pass on to Elizabeth and Mary Stuart, and that's why I've put this. It's just a partial genealogy. I've excluded certain things and just kept to the essential facts. So you might refer to the board as I go through this. Mary, first of all, was the daughter of James V of Scotland and his French wife, Mary of Guise. She was also, importantly, the granddaughter of Margaret, Henry's elder sister, who married James IV, but it wasn't a marriage that lasted very long because James was killed in 1513 in the Battle of Flodden Field, where there was a great massacre of the Scots. Being the granddaughter of Margaret was a claim to the English throne. But of course, it was far less than that of Elizabeth, who was directly descended from Henry. Okay. So the two, Elizabeth regarded Mary as a cousin, but it was one generation removed, really. I mean, her true cousin was James V, really. But she regarded her as a close relative. Mary had, to say the least, a very interesting life. Due to her mother's influence, she was educated in France as a Catholic. And in 1559, at the age of 16, she married the even younger Dauphin, that is the heir to the French throne. And she became Queen of France briefly, or Queen Consort, strictly speaking, in 1559, when her husband became Francois II. But sadly, he died after 1 year. He died in 1560. So Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, though in fact she had been queen in Scotland since her father had died. Her father died at 1542. So between 1542 and 61, the Scottish nation was ruled by a regency, a confederation of lords. We'll come back to that later on. So Mary married her cousin, Lord Darnley. And basically, they had one child who was the future James I of England, but immediately James VI of Scotland. She had a secretary, David Rizzio. And Rizzio, we believe, or historians believe, became Mary's lover. And Darnley murdered him, no doubt at all, but Darnley himself was lured to a location on the outskirts of Edinburgh where there was a bomb, and he was blown to pieces. Mary was implicated, but nothing was absolutely proved. So in 1567, she married another lord, the Earl of Bothwell, 1567. And basically, that was too much for the Scottish nobles. I think it was partly also the influence of Mary of Guise, Mary's mother, which was resented by the Scottish nobles. Anyway, basically, there was a revolt which was successful. The confederation of Scottish nobles prevailed against Mary's army. She was defeated at a place called Carberry Hill, which is near Dalkeith. So what did Mary do? Well, she fled to England. She managed to do that. She fled to England and to Elizabeth's mercy. But Elizabeth imprisoned her. And from that time onwards, she was in one prison after another. Her son, James I, the future James I, that is, was then educated as a Protestant. An act of Parliament before that had declared Scotland to be a Protestant country. So he was educated actually as a Presbyterian, and obviously that had a lot to do with the influence of John Knox. So that was the situation. Mary was imprisoned in many places in England. One of them was at Bolton Castle, not too far away in Wensleydale. Baron Scrope, or Lord Scrope, was the one who was in charge of that castle, Baron Scrope, but she was in many other prisons during the time that she had in England, which is 19 years. Now, Elizabeth, partly, I think, because she regarded Mary as a true cousin, and she also regarded her as the rightful Queen of Scotland, refrained from having her executed. Her Privy Council tried to persuade her, and even William Cecil, and she resisted all of them and refused to have her executed. But an event in 1587 basically changed that point. Mary had been 19 years in England. That was the Babington plot, where 6 people got together into a covenant and decided that they would try and raise a force to eliminate Elizabeth and put Mary on the throne. Now, it was Walsingham, actually, who intercepted a letter from Mary to these 6 plotters, which clearly implicated her in the plot. And Elizabeth then was left really with no choice. Even then, she did it for a while. But eventually, Mary was put to death at Fotheringhay Castle, near Peterborough. I don't think it's any coincidence that a year after that, Philip sent his 130 ship, 22,000 army against England. So that's the background to Elizabeth's reign and also to Mary, Queen of Scots. And as I said, the child of her and Darnley became James VI of Scotland and James I of England. Now, the most interesting part I find of the reign of Elizabeth was the rise of the separatists. At first, they had no credence with Elizabeth, but they did gain some influence later on. The separatists, as I've said previously, held to the independence of the church from the state. They did not believe in an established church, but they believed that the two were absolutely separate. Both under God's sovereignty, certainly, but separate institutions. They were opposed to Erastianism, which commenced, as I've said before, in the Constantinian Church in the 4th century. So really it had existed for 1,000 years and indeed continues to exist. The close relationship between state and church and the interference of the state. The monarch continues to be head of the church in the Church of England, basically, whatever religion he or she might have. That remains as said. Now that's an outcome of Erastianism, but also, of course, in earlier times, the state was much more involved in the organization of the church. So, who were these people and how did they start? Well, the majority of Puritans were basically separatists who also desired a greater simplicity and purity of worship in the church. They were sturdy Calvinists like Hooper and Latimer, and they thought at first that further reform was possible, even under the Elizabethan settlement. But later, it became obvious that no change that they favoured, further reform, was going to occur. And their opposition became more vocal later on in Elizabeth's reign. And remember the vestments controversy involving Hooper. He refused to wear vestments at first, but then he changed his mind for the sake of peace, really, and said he would wear them on public occasions. Well, a second vestments controversy arose in Elizabeth's reign, particularly in 1566. The Puritans, separatists, objected to ornate buildings and wished for New Testament simplicity in worship. Ecclesiastical discipline is entirely the prerogative of the church. That was their position. So who were the prime movers? Well, the first and most important man who held a very powerful position was a professor of divinity at Cambridge University, Thomas Cartwright. He was professor from 1569, and he was greatly respected and had a good deal of influence. He was a friend of the Earl of Leicester, who, as I've said before, had the ear of the Queen. As regards the Church of England, he believed that the Church of England should adopt a Presbyterian polity, based originally on the Genevan model. He was the leading Puritan of his day, a man of intellectual eminence. He was generally acknowledged, and his views were acknowledged. The second one I want to mention is Robert Brown. Is that Robert Brown? Yeah. Robert Brown. He was a separatist, English separatist leader in East Anglia. East Anglia was a centre really for Anabaptist settlement. A lot of Anabaptists came over in the reign of Edward VI and suffered, of course, under Mary and her heresy laws. But Robert Brown had a very clear understanding of the local church. Two allies of Robert Brown were Henry Barrow and John Greenwood, and both of them were more outspoken than Brown, and both of them were martyred in Elizabeth's reign. So there was still a suffering martyrdom for their views. Brown had a truly New Testament view of the local church, as the Anabaptists did. He wrote like this of the early church: "A local church is rightly constituted when there is a gathering of regenerate persons whose oral confession and sincere beliefs attest to their salvation." So there was no hypocrisy about them. It was evident they were believers. Such a company evidenced reformation of life. The sacraments are ministered and the word preached according to the principles laid down in Acts chapter 2. Very clear idea and very biblical idea. I'll come back to that later on next time. But then there were the Welsh separatists. They were a separate movement. And again, the first one, a man called John Penry, paved the way for separatism in Wales. But he too was too outspoken for the Elizabethan authorities, and he too was martyred. The work was continued by a man called William Roth, who basically continued separatist influence. And not long afterwards, the first Welsh separatist church was established later in the reign of Charles I at Llanbacus on the outskirts of Newport. And the pastor, did you get Craddock?
I do.
Yeah, the pastor was a man called Walter Craddock, who was a remarkable man. A very interesting comment that when the evangelical awakening occurred in the next century, under people like Daniel Rowland, Howell Harris, and William Williams. The older people, and they were quite old people, declared that the Cradockians had returned, which I think was a testimony to the effect of Craddock's ministry. As I say, he was a separatist and he was a Baptist. And from that time onwards, separatist churches began to emerge in Wales, as in parts of England. The final figure was a man called Vavassar Powell. He was a little bit later because most of his ministry was in the time of James I and Charles I, and then into the reign of Cromwell. And he was very much, like Craddock, a Cromwellian in his beliefs. And he's described by the 16th century historian and essayist, Scottish man, Thomas Carlyle. He made this comment about Powell. It's very interesting. Shows a very good knowledge, a very good grasp of the English language. He said of Powell, and I quote, "He had the most flamy and fuliginous doctrines." Fuliginous means smoky, superadding Anabaptistry to Soncollotism. What a phrase, eh? What a phrase. The last bit needs explaining. What was Soncollotism? Well, Soncollotism in translation means without culottes, and it was a term of abuse by the royalists, in this case, to the revolutionaries. They were without culottes. Culottes were fashionable, but these men wore the common pantaloons. So it was a term of despisal, really. But it was a reference to those revolutionaries. So basically, they're talking about a man who was on fire for the gospel, who had the great doctrines of the faith, and was revolutionary as regards his church polity. A remarkable man. So just summarizing, all these men, the Welshmen and the early Englishmen, were Puritans, desiring purity of life in the believer and purity of worship in the church, and separation, clear separation of church and state. In these things, and this is an important factor, in these things, they look back beyond the Reformation to the early church. And this would be one of my criticisms of the Reformation. Coming to that next time, I'm hoping to deal with a critique of the Reformation. And to my mind, a critique is positive and negative. I want to outline the positive things that the Reformers stood for and held, but also those things which I felt they failed on. It's not an easy thing to do, because the Reformation was a remarkable period, and Protestant reformers were remarkable men. But I think we do need to do this, actually, just to get the thing objective. Well, thank you for listening. I'll hand over to John.